The morning sun barely touched the horizon when Sarah Mitchell walked through the gates of the Naval Training Facility. Her worn boots made soft sounds against the concrete as she approached the registration desk. Behind her, the sound of male voices grew louder, a mixture of confidence and nervous energy filling the air. She kept her eyes forward, her spine straight, her expression calm. The man at the desk looked up from his clipboard, his eyebrows raising slightly when he saw her. He glanced down at his list, then back at her face. His mouth opened as if to speak, then closed again. Sarah had seen that look before. It was the same expression she had encountered at every stage of her journey to this moment. She handed him her papers without a word. He took them slowly, scanning the documents with more attention than seemed necessary. Around them, other recruits were processing through quickly, receiving their assignments and moving toward the training grounds. But Sarah stood there waiting, while the man behind the desk seemed to be searching for something in her paperwork that would explain her presence. Finally, he stamped her documents and pointed toward a building in the distance. Sarah nodded her thanks and walked in that direction, aware of the eyes following her movement. The whispers started almost immediately. She did not turn around to acknowledge them. She had learned long ago that reactions only fed the fire. The training facility sprawled across hundreds of acres, a complex web of obstacle courses, shooting ranges, and buildings designed to break down civilians and rebuild them into warriors. Sarah had researched every inch of this place before arriving. She knew what was coming. She had prepared for it in ways that most people could not understand. Inside the equipment building, rows of gear lined the walls. Tactical vests, helmets, boots, and weapons were organized with military precision. A sergeant stood near the weapons rack, his thick arms crossed over his chest. He was a mountain of a man, with a shaved head and a scar running down the left side of his face. His eyes were cold and calculating as he watched the new recruits file in. Sarah joined the line of men waiting to receive their training weapons. She was the only woman in the group. The men around her were of various sizes and builds, but they all shared a certain swagger, a confidence born from years of being told they belonged in spaces like this. They joked with each other, talking about their backgrounds, their reasons for being here, their expectations of glory. When Sarah reached the front of the line, the sergeant looked down at her. His expression did not change, but something flickered in his eyes. He reached behind him and pulled out a standard-issue rifle, then paused. Instead of handing it to her, he set it on the counter between them. One of the men behind Sarah laughed. It was a short, sharp sound that cut through the ambient noise of the room. Others joined in, their amusement growing louder. The sergeant's lips curved into something that was not quite a smile. Sarah reached for the rifle. The sergeant's hand came down on top of it, holding it in place. He leaned forward slightly, his voice low enough that only she could hear. His words were simple but loaded with meaning. He asked her if she was sure she was in the right place. He suggested that perhaps she had made a wrong turn somewhere. He offered her an easy way out, a chance to walk away before she embarrassed herself. Sarah's hand remained steady on the rifle. She met his eyes without blinking, without flinching. Her voice when she spoke was quiet but clear. She told him she was exactly where she needed to be. She asked him politely to release the weapon so she could proceed with her training. The sergeant held her gaze for a long moment. Behind Sarah, the laughter had grown. Some of the men were making comments now, loud enough for everyone to hear. They questioned whether she could even lift the rifle. They wondered aloud if she knew which end the bullets came out of. They suggested she might be better suited to a different kind of service. Sarah ignored them completely. Her entire focus remained on the sergeant in front of her. She had faced this kind of resistance before in different forms in different places. She had learned that the only way through was forward. Never back, never sideways. Only forward. The sergeant finally released the rifle. Sarah lifted it smoothly, checking the weight, the balance, the feel of it in her hands. Her movements were practiced, professional. She performed a quick function check, her fingers moving with the kind of muscle memory that came from thousands of repetitions. Then she slung it over her shoulder and turned to leave. As she walked toward the door, one of the recruits stepped partially into her path. He was tall, with the build of someone who had spent years in a gym. His smile was mocking as he looked down at her. He made a comment about women and weapons, about how some things were not meant to mix. His friends laughed harder. Sarah stepped around him without responding. She had learned that words in moments like these were wasted energy. Action spoke louder. Results spoke loudest of all. She would let her performance do her talking. Outside, the training grounds stretched before her. She could see obstacle courses in the distance, their wooden walls and rope climbs stark against the morning sky. She could hear the sound of someone shouting commands, the rhythm of running feet, the controlled chaos of military training in progress. Sarah found a quiet spot near one of the buildings and began her own warm-up routine. She stretched her muscles systematically, preparing her body for what was to come. She had trained for this moment for years, long before she had submitted her application, long before she had passed the initial screenings. She had been preparing herself physically and mentally. Other recruits were gathering near the main training area now. Sarah finished her stretches and joined them, positioning herself near the back of the formation. A new instructor appeared, this one an older man with gray hair and a weathered face that spoke of decades in the service. He began calling out names from a roster, assigning people to different training groups. When he called Sarah's name, several heads turned. The instructor paused, looking up from his clipboard to find her in the crowd. His expression was neutral, professional. He assigned her to Group 3 and moved on to the next name. But Sarah noticed the subtle change in the atmosphere. The men assigned to her group exchanged glances. Some looked annoyed. Others looked amused. None looked welcoming. The morning progressed with a series of briefings and orientations. Sarah listened carefully to every word, taking mental notes. She observed the facility layout, the training schedule, the hierarchy of instructors. She watched how the other recruits interacted, identifying the natural leaders, the followers, the ones who would wash out early. By midday, when they were finally released for their first meal, Sarah had already been tested a dozen times in small ways. Someone had accidentally bumped into her hard enough to make her stumble. Another recruit had tried to take her spot in formation. The comments continued, always just loud enough for her to hear but quiet enough to deny if confronted. Sarah ate alone in the cafeteria, her rifle propped carefully beside her seat. She noticed that the table around her remained empty, even as the facility filled with hungry trainees. That was fine. She had not come here to make friends. She had come here to prove something far more important. The afternoon heat was oppressive as Group 3 assembled at the shooting range. The smell of gun oil and burnt powder hung in the air, mixing with dust and sweat. Sarah stood in line with the others, her rifle held properly at her side, her posture relaxed but alert. The range instructor was a compact man with nervous energy, constantly moving as he explained the basic safety protocols. Most of the men around Sarah were half listening. They had grown up around guns, had shot targets since childhood, had fathers and brothers who had taught them to handle weapons. Their confidence bordered on arrogance. Sarah remained focused on the instructor's every word, even though she could have recited the safety rules in her sleep. When it came time to approach the firing line, the instructor began assigning positions. Sarah was placed at the far end, isolated from the main group. She did not react to this obvious attempt to separate her. She simply moved to her designated spot and began preparing her weapon. The recruit next to her, a broad-shouldered man with a thick neck and small eyes, watched her with undisguised skepticism. He made a show of loading his magazine with exaggerated competence, his movements loud and theatrical. He announced to no one in particular that he had been shooting since he was 5 years old. He bragged about winning competitions back home. He predicted he would score perfect marks on this basic qualification. Sarah loaded her own magazine quietly, efficiently. Her hands moved with practiced ease, each motion economical and precise. She had spent countless hours on ranges like this, though no one here knew that. No one had asked about her background. They had simply assumed she had none. The command to commence firing came sharp and clear. Down the line, rifles began to crack. The sound was rhythmic, controlled. Sarah settled into her shooting position, her breathing steady, her focus narrowed to the target downrange. She squeezed the trigger with the kind of smooth pressure that came from years of training. The rifle kicked against her shoulder, familiar and manageable. She fired her rounds in careful succession, not rushing, not showing off. Each trigger pull was deliberate. Each shot placed exactly where she intended it. When her magazine was empty, she cleared her weapon and stepped back from the line, waiting for the ceasefire command. The instructor walked down the line, checking targets. His face remained impassive as he examined each one, making notes on his clipboard. When he reached the man who had been bragging earlier, he paused. The target showed scattered hits, several completely off the paper. The instructor made a mark and moved on without comment. The recruit's face flushed red. When the instructor reached Sarah's target, he stopped. He stared at it for a long moment, then looked back at Sarah, then at the target again. Every round had hit the center mass. The grouping was tight, professional. The kind of shooting that came from serious training and natural talent combined. The instructor called over the senior range officer. The two men examined Sarah's target together, speaking in low voices. Other recruits began to crane their necks, trying to see what had caused the commotion. Word spread quickly down the line. The woman had outshot everyone. The reaction was immediate and varied. Some men looked surprised. Others looked skeptical, as if they suspected some kind of trick or mistake. A few looked openly hostile, their egos bruised by the undeniable evidence of her skill. The recruit who had been bragging earlier glared at Sarah with pure resentment. The senior range officer approached Sarah directly. He asked her where she had learned to shoot. His tone was not friendly, but it was no longer dismissive. Sarah answered simply that she had been training for a long time. She did not elaborate. She did not need to justify herself. The officer studied her for another moment, then nodded curtly and walked away. The training continued, but something had shifted. The easy mockery from earlier had been replaced by something more complex. Confusion, suspicion, and in some cases, the first stirrings of respect, though most would never admit it. The next phase of training took them to the obstacle course. This was the domain where physical strength and endurance were tested without mercy. The course was brutal by design, intended to weed out those who lacked the mental and physical toughness required. Walls to climb, ropes to traverse, muddy pits to crawl through, and endless running between stations. The instructor for this section was a lean, hard-faced woman named Sergeant Torres. She was one of the few female instructors at the facility, and her reputation was legendary. She was known to be even harder on women than on men. Determined to prove that she played no favorites, her eyes swept over the assembled group with cold assessment. She explained the course in clipped, efficient sentences. There were no shortcuts. There were no excuses. Everyone would complete every obstacle, or they would repeat the course until they did. Time standards had to be met. Failures would be noted. Multiple failures would result in dismissal from the program. The men in Group 3 seemed energized by this challenge. This was where they expected to shine, where their natural advantages in size and strength would prove decisive. They stretched and joked, their earlier tension from the shooting range forgotten. Several glanced at Sarah with knowing looks. This would be where she broke. This would be where reality set in. Sergeant Torres sent them out in pairs. Sarah was matched with a tall, athletic recruit named Morrison, who had boasted earlier about his college football career. He took off at a sprint when the whistle blew, clearly trying to create distance between himself and Sarah. She maintained her own pace, steady and controlled. The first obstacle was a 6-foot wall. Morrison attacked it with raw power, pulling himself up and over with brute strength. Sarah approached with technique, using her momentum and leg drive to carry herself up and over smoothly. By the time Morrison landed on the other side, Sarah was already moving toward the next challenge. The rope traverse came next, suspended over a muddy pit. Morrison's weight worked against him here, his arms straining as he hand-over-handed his way across. Sarah moved with better efficiency, using her legs to assist, her smaller frame requiring less pure upper body strength. She reached the far side several seconds before him. Morrison's face was already showing strain. He was powerful, but he had relied on explosive strength rather than endurance. Sarah's training had been different. She had built her conditioning over years, layer upon layer of cardiovascular fitness and muscular endurance. She did not rely on any single attribute. She had developed them all. The crawl through the mud pit was next. This was designed to be miserable, to test mental toughness as much as physical ability. Cold, thick mud that got into everything. Barbed wire low overhead that forced you to stay flat, to inch forward through the muck. Morrison hesitated at the edge, his face showing disgust. Sarah dropped immediately and began crawling, her movement smooth and continuous. She kept her head down, her elbows driving her forward. The mud was cold and uncomfortable, but discomfort was temporary. Stopping was failure. By the time she emerged on the far side, Morrison was only halfway through, struggling and cursing. Sarah wiped the worst of the mud from her face and kept moving. The course was not finished. There was no time to wait for anyone. The remainder of the obstacles tested every aspect of physical fitness. Balance beams, rope climbs, tire runs, and monkey bars. Each one challenged a different muscle group, a different type of coordination. Sarah moved through them with methodical determination, never rushing but never stopping. When she crossed the final finish line, Sergeant Torres was waiting with a stopwatch. The sergeant's expression did not change, but she made a note on her clipboard. Sarah's time was well within the passing standard. More than that, it was competitive with the best times of the day so far. Morrison finished several minutes later, gasping and covered in mud. His earlier confidence had evaporated. Other pairs continued to struggle through the course, some passing, some failing completely. By the end of the session, 3 recruits had been pulled aside and told they would need to retry the course the following day. As the group gathered for dismissal, Sarah noticed the change in how people positioned themselves around her. There was more space now, but it was a different kind of space. Not the space of exclusion, but the space of uncertainty. She had disrupted their expectations. She had proven that their assumptions were wrong, and now they did not know quite how to categorize her. That evening in the barracks, Sarah cleaned her rifle and prepared her gear for the next day. Around her, conversations flowed, but she remained focused on her tasks. She had learned early in life that consistency was everything. One good day meant nothing. She needed to be excellent every single day without exception, without excuses. A shadow fell across her workspace. Sarah looked up to find Morrison standing there, his expression complicated. He seemed to struggle with what he wanted to say. Finally, he asked where she had trained before coming here. His tone was not exactly friendly, but the mockery from earlier was gone. Sarah considered her answer carefully. She told him she had trained in various places with various people. She had sought out the best instruction she could find. She had worked harder than everyone around her because she had known she would need to be better, just to be considered equal. Morrison nodded slowly, processing this. He seemed about to say, the days blurred together into a relentless cycle of physical punishment and mental strain. Sarah woke before dawn each morning, her body aching from the previous day's training. She performed her personal routine in the pre-dawn darkness, adding extra work to what was already an exhausting schedule. While others grabbed precious minutes of sleep, she was doing pull-ups, running extra miles, practicing weapon drills. The training grew progressively harder. The instructors introduced hand-to-hand combat, small unit tactics, water confidence exercises, and navigation challenges. Each new phase was designed to expose weaknesses, to find the breaking point of every recruit. The attrition rate was high. Every few days, someone's bunk would be empty, their gear cleared out, their name removed from the roster. In the combatives, training, Sarah faced her greatest physical challenges. The men had significant advantages in size and strength. In straight grappling matches, these advantages were difficult to overcome. She absorbed punishing throws and holds, learning to use technique and speed where she lacked power. Her body collected bruises like medals, purple and yellow marks that tracked her progress through each session. One afternoon, she was paired against a recruit named Jackson, a former wrestler who outweighed her by 80 pounds. The other recruits gathered around the mat, their interest obvious. This matchup seemed impossibly unfair. Jackson clearly thought so too, hesitating to fully engage at first, as if fighting a woman at full intensity was beneath him. Sarah used his hesitation against him. She shot in low, using a leg sweep she had practiced thousands of times. Jackson went down hard, surprised by her speed and commitment. Before he could recover, she had secured a dominant position. The watching crowd went silent. Jackson's pride kicked in then. He began fighting in earnest, using his strength to try to power out of her control. For several intense minutes they grappled, neither able to gain a decisive advantage. Sarah's technique kept her competitive, but Jackson's raw power kept reversing her positions. Finally, the instructor called time. No winner, but no loser either. It was the best outcome Sarah could have hoped for against such an opponent. Jackson stood slowly, breathing hard. He looked at Sarah with new eyes, something like respect grudgingly appearing on his face. He extended his hand. Sarah took it. The handshake was brief but significant. Another barrier had cracked. The water training tested different fears. The instructors called it drown-proofing, though that sanitized term did not capture the terror of being bound hand and foot and dropped into a pool. The exercise was designed to teach comfort in the water even under the worst conditions. It was also designed to identify those who would panic in aquatic environments. Sarah had prepared for this too. She had spent months training in pools, learning to control her breathing, to manage fear, to trust her body's natural buoyancy. When her turn came, she was bound and dropped into the deep end. The initial shock of submersion was intense, the instinct to struggle nearly overwhelming. But she forced herself to relax, to sink, then to use gentle dolphin kicks to rise. Breaking the surface for air, then allowing herself to sink again, finding a rhythm. She completed the exercise successfully, though her legs were shaking when they finally pulled her out. Several recruits had already failed this test, their panic too strong to overcome. 2 had refused to even attempt it. Sarah sat on the pool deck catching her breath, her heart still racing from the adrenaline. But she had passed. She was still here. The navigation training took them into rough terrain outside the facility. Armed with only a map, compass, and coordinates, they had to find specific checkpoints over miles of wilderness. The exercise was conducted at night, in pairs, with strict time limits. Failure to reach all checkpoints meant repeating the exercise with added penalties. Sarah was paired with a quiet recruit named Chen who had kept mostly to himself during training. He was technically proficient but seemed to lack confidence in leadership situations. As they studied their map in the brief preparation time, Sarah suggested a route. Chen agreed immediately, seeming relieved to defer to someone else's judgment. They moved out into the darkness, Sarah navigating while Chen maintained security. The terrain was unforgiving, filled with steep hills, thick brush, and hidden obstacles. Twice they had to alter their route to avoid impassable sections. Sarah adjusted their bearing each time, maintaining their progress toward the checkpoints. They reached the first checkpoint ahead of schedule. Chen seemed surprised but said nothing. They pushed on toward the second. Halfway there they heard voices. Another pair of recruits was lost, arguing about which direction to go. Sarah and Chen moved past them quietly, maintaining their own timeline. At the third checkpoint, they encountered a twist. The marker had coordinates for a fourth unplanned checkpoint, an additional challenge for those who arrived early. Sarah looked at Chen questioningly. He nodded. They would attempt it. The extra credit could matter later. The fourth checkpoint was in the most difficult terrain yet, requiring them to navigate down a steep ravine and back up the other side. In the darkness, every step was treacherous. Sarah moved carefully, testing each foothold. Behind her, Chen matched her pace, trusting her pathfinding. They reached the hidden checkpoint and found only 3 other teams had made it there. The instructor present at that location made a note of their arrival time and names. Sarah saw him look at her twice, as if confirming what he was seeing. A woman, here, at this checkpoint that most men had not even attempted. The journey back to base was long and exhausting. Dawn was breaking as they finally approached the facility. They were among the first teams to return, and the only team to have completed all 4 checkpoints. As they checked in, Sarah saw Sergeant Torres observing from a distance. The sergeant's face remained impassive, but she made another note on her ever-present clipboard. In the following days, Sarah noticed a shift in the overall atmosphere. The open mockery had largely stopped. The comments were fewer, more careful. Some recruits still maintained their hostility, their resentment of her presence burning quietly. But others had begun to acknowledge her abilities, if not yet accepting her fully as one of them. The training moved into more advanced weapon systems. They learned to operate machine guns, grenade launchers, and explosive devices. Sarah approached each new weapon system with the same focused intensity she brought to everything else. She memorized specifications, practiced loading and clearing procedures, studied malfunction drills until they became automatic. During a machine gun qualification, a malfunction occurred on her weapon. The instructor watched as Sarah immediately implemented the correct clearing procedure, hands moving with trained precision. The weapon came back into operation within seconds. The instructor gave a slight nod of approval before moving on to check other shooters. That evening, as Sarah was cleaning her equipment, Morrison approached her again. This time, he was not alone. Jackson and Chen were with him. The three men stood there awkwardly for a moment as if unsure how to begin. Finally, Morrison spoke. He said that some of the guys had been talking. They had noticed how hard she worked, how she never complained, how she pulled her weight and then some. He said they wanted her to know that whatever they might have thought at the beginning, she had earned her place here. Sarah looked up at them, weighing their words. She knew this was not a universal sentiment. She knew there were still plenty of recruits who resented her presence and always would. But these men were extending an olive branch, and that mattered. She thanked them simply and went back to her work. They stood there a moment longer, then left. The weeks continued to grind forward. The training grew more specialized, more intense. They practiced combat medicine, learning to treat gunshot wounds and blast injuries under pressure. They conducted long-range reconnaissance exercises, operating with minimal sleep and maximum stress. They trained in urban environments, learning to clear buildings and operate in complex terrain. Sarah excelled in the tactical training. Her mind worked well under pressure, processing information quickly, making decisions with confidence. During force-on-force exercises using simulation rounds, she demonstrated an aggressive fighting style that surprised many. She was not passive or hesitant. She was a tactician who understood violence and how to apply it effectively. In one memorable exercise, her team was tasked with defending a position against a numerically superior attacking force. Sarah positioned her teammates strategically, creating interlocking fields of fire. When the attack came, her team held, inflicting heavy simulated casualties on the attackers. The exercise ended with Sarah's team victorious despite the odds. The instructor analyzing the exercise specifically called out her leadership and tactical decision-making. He used her defense as an example for the entire training group. Sarah felt the weight of dozens of eyes on her during that debrief. Some looked at her with new respect, others with renewed resentment. She kept her own expression neutral, accepting neither praise nor criticism externally. But internally, she allowed herself a small moment of satisfaction. She was proving what she had always known: physical disadvantages, that she belonged here just as much as any man. The graduation ceremony from basic training was subdued compared to what most military graduations involved. There were no families present, no photographs, no public celebration. This was a pipeline to something else, something that required anonymity and discretion. Those who had made it through received a simple acknowledgement and new orders. They would move on to the next phase of selection, a phase that would make the previous weeks look gentle by comparison. Sarah received her orders along with 32 others. Of the original 70 recruits who had started the program, more than half had been eliminated. Some had quit. Some had been injured. Some had simply failed to meet the standards. The survivors were harder, leaner, more confident than they had been at the start. But they were also wary. They knew what was coming would be worse. The new facility was in a different location, more remote, more isolated. The training here was conducted by a different cadre of instructors, men with quiet eyes and weathered faces who moved with the kind of confidence that came from real-world experience. These were not regular military trainers. These were operators, people who had done the actual work in actual places against actual enemies. The head instructor was introduced simply as Commander Hayes. He was a man of average height and build, the kind of person who could disappear in a crowd. But his eyes were sharp and assessing, missing nothing. When he looked at Sarah, his expression did not change. He showed neither surprise nor disapproval. He simply registered her presence and moved on. Commander Hayes explained the next phase in simple terms. They would be pushed beyond anything they had experienced. The training would be designed to find their absolute limits and then push past those limits. Some would not make it. Many would not make it. Those who did would be entrusted with missions that most people would never know existed. The training began immediately. No warm-up period, no adjustment time. They were thrown into deep water and expected to swim. The physical challenges were more intense than before, but that was not the main focus anymore. The instructors now targeted mental toughness, emotional control, and decision-making under extreme stress. They were subjected to interrogation resistance training, locked in small dark boxes for hours, exposed to loud noises and temperature extremes, questioned aggressively by instructors playing the role of hostile captors. The goal was to teach them to resist, to protect information, to maintain their cover even when everything in their body and mind was screaming for relief. Sarah found this training particularly challenging. The physical torture she could handle. She had trained her body to endure pain. But the psychological pressure was different. The instructors were skilled at finding emotional vulnerabilities and exploiting them. They would make personal attacks, question her worth, her abilities, her very right to exist in this space. During one session, she was confined in a stress position for hours, while instructors took turns verbally attacking her. They said she was weak. They said she was a diversity hire, a checkbox, a political statement rather than a real operator. They said she would get real soldiers killed with her inadequacy. They said she should quit now before she caused harm to others. Sarah controlled her breathing and retreated into her mental fortress. She had built this defense over years of facing similar attacks in different forms. She separated her true self from the words being thrown at her. She recognized them as tools, techniques designed to break her, and therefore she could see them as just that, not as truth. She did not break. When they finally released her from the stress position, her legs nearly gave out. Her muscles were cramping, her body screaming in protest, but her mind was intact. She looked each instructor in the eye as she left the room. She had passed their test. The training continued with advanced marksmanship. They learned to shoot from helicopters, from moving vehicles, from unconventional positions. They trained in low-light and no-light conditions. They practiced shooting while exhausted, while injured, while under simulated fire. The standards were impossibly high. Missing a target was not acceptable. Slow response times were not acceptable. Anything less than perfection was considered failure. Sarah spent extra hours on the range, even when her fingers were raw from trigger pulls and her shoulder was bruised from recoil. She shot until the movements became as natural as breathing. She trained until she could hit targets in the dark, tired, stressed, and still place her rounds exactly where they needed to go. One of the new instructors, a lean man named Carter who moved like a predator, took particular interest in Sarah's shooting. He watched her more closely than the others, always finding something to criticize. Her stance was wrong. Her breathing was off. Her follow-through was inadequate. Nothing she did seemed to meet his standards. Sarah accepted his criticism without complaint and worked to improve. She knew what this was. Carter was testing her differently than the others, trying to see if she would crack under constant negative feedback. She refused to give him that satisfaction. She simply got better. During an advanced combat scenario, her team was tasked with a simulated hostage rescue. The situation was complex, with multiple rooms, unknown numbers of hostile forces, and strict rules of engagement to avoid hitting the hostages. Sarah was assigned as the team's breacher, responsible for making entry and being first through the door. When the exercise began, Sarah moved with controlled aggression. She breached the door efficiently and flowed into the room, her weapon up and ready. The scenario unfolded quickly. Multiple threats appeared, some mixed among hostages. Sarah engaged the threats with precision, her shots exact. Behind her, her team cleared the remaining rooms. The exercise ended with all hostages rescued and all threats neutralized. 0 civilian casualties. The after-action review was conducted by Carter. He went through each moment of the exercise with brutal detail, pointing out every minor flaw, every split second of hesitation. But at the end he paused. He looked directly at Sarah and said her breach and initial clear were textbook perfect. Coming from him, it was high praise. The next phase introduced them to specialized equipment and techniques. They learned advanced communications, cryptography, surveillance, and counter-surveillance. They studied foreign weapons systems and tactics. They were taught to operate in foreign environments, to blend in, to become invisible when necessary. Sarah absorbed everything like a sponge. She had always been a quick learner, but here she pushed herself even further. She knew that any gap in her knowledge, any weakness in her skills, would be used as justification to remove her. She could not afford to be average. She had to be exceptional. The training took them overseas for realistic environment exposure. They operated in urban areas, learning to navigate foreign cities to conduct surveillance without being noticed, to gather intelligence while maintaining cover. Sarah found she had a talent for this work. Her gender, which had been seen as a disadvantage in pure physical contexts, became an asset here. She drew less attention in many environments. People's preconceptions worked in her favor. During one exercise in a crowded marketplace, Sarah successfully tracked a target for 6 hours through complex urban terrain without being detected. The instructors reviewing her performance noted her excellent tradecraft. She had blended seamlessly into the environment, adapting her behavior to match local patterns, never standing out or drawing attention. But not everyone was impressed with her progress. A recruit named Briggs had maintained his hostility throughout all phases of training. He was talented, skilled, and absolutely convinced that women had no place in this field. He made his opinions known whenever he could, always just carefully enough to avoid official consequences. During a team training exercise, Briggs was assigned as team leader with Sarah on his team. He gave her the most dangerous positions consistently, seemed to hope she would fail or be injured. During one particularly hazardous scenario, he assigned her to a role that required her to expose herself to sustained simulated fire, while the rest of the team maneuvered. Sarah executed her assigned role perfectly, drawing fire exactly as needed while maintaining her own survival. The exercise succeeded because she held her position despite the incoming fire. Afterward, Briggs said nothing to her, but his resentment was obvious. The final weeks of this phase focused on mission planning and leadership. They were given complex scenarios and required to develop operational plans, brief their teams, and execute their missions. This was where strategic thinking mattered as much as physical skills. When Sarah's turn came to lead, she was given an especially difficult scenario. A time-sensitive target in a complex urban environment with limited intelligence and significant civilian presence. She spent hours developing her plan, considering every variable, every contingency. Her brief was clear, detailed, and confident. The execution went smoothly until a deliberate curveball was thrown. The instructors changed a key piece of intelligence mid-mission, forcing Sarah to adapt in real time. She made the necessary adjustments quickly, trusting her team to execute the modified plan. The mission succeeded with minimal complications. His questions were probing, designed to annoy. The notification came without ceremony. Sarah found a folder on her bunk containing new orders, a plane ticket, and a list of equipment to bring. The destination was redacted. The purpose was listed simply as final assessment. She had 48 hours to prepare and report to the departure point. Around the barracks, others were finding similar folders, or they were not. Those who did not receive folders were quietly reassigned to other units. Their journey ended here. Of the 32 who had started this phase, only 14 received the folders. Sarah noticed that Briggs was among those who did. So were Morrison, Jackson, and Chen. Carter, the instructor who had pushed her so hard on the range, would be going as well, though apparently in a different capacity. The group was getting smaller, more select, more elite with each cut. The flight took them to a remote location that Sarah could not immediately identify. The landscape was harsh and unforgiving, desert terrain that stretched to distant mountains. The facility here was smaller than previous training sites, more austere, more focused. This was a place designed for one purpose only: to test people beyond the breaking point. They were met by a new cadre of instructors, but Commander Hayes was there as well, which surprised Sarah. She had assumed he would stay at the previous facility. His presence here signaled something important about this final phase. He addressed the gathered candidates in his usual economical style. This phase, he explained, would last approximately 3 weeks. It would combine everything they had learned with new stressors designed to simulate the absolute worst conditions they might face in actual operations. They would be sleep-deprived, food-deprived, and pushed to mental and physical collapse. They would be hunted, captured, interrogated. They would face moral dilemmas with no clear right answers. Some would quit, some would fail. Those who succeeded would earn a place in one of the most selective units in the world. The training began that same night with a forced march carrying heavy packs through the desert. The pace was punishing. The heat from the day still radiated from the sand. They marched for hours without break, covering mile after mile of difficult terrain. Sarah focused on her breathing, her footfalls, the mechanical process of putting one foot in front of the other. Around her, Men twice her size were struggling, gasping, falling behind. She maintained her position near the front of the formation, refusing to give any ground. Her pack felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Her feet were blistering inside her boots. Her shoulders screamed under the weight of the straps. But she did not slow down. She could not afford to show weakness, not here, not now. They marched through the night and into the next morning, covering nearly 50 miles before they were finally allowed to stop. The moment they halted, they were immediately given new tasks. Set up defensive positions, conduct maintenance on weapons, prepare for incoming scenarios. There was no rest, no pause, no acknowledgement that they had just completed a grueling march. Sarah forced her exhausted body to comply. She set her position, checked her weapon, prepared for whatever came next. Around her, some candidates were moving slowly, their exhaustion obvious. A few had collapsed entirely, unable to continue. The instructors moved among them, making notes, assessing, judging. The scenario that followed was a simulated combat situation. They were divided into small teams and given objectives to complete, while under simulated enemy fire. Sarah's team had to reach a target building, gather intelligence, and extract without being captured. The opposing force was made up of experienced instructors who knew every trick the candidates might try. Sarah's team moved cautiously, using terrain and darkness to mask their approach. She was not the team leader for this mission, but she contributed to the planning and execution. Halfway to their objective, they were ambushed. Simulated fire erupted from multiple directions. The team scattered, seeking cover, returning fire. In the chaos, Sarah saw one of her teammates get hit by a simulation round and go down, playing wounded as per the exercise rules. Without thinking, she broke from cover, moved to his position, and began dragging him toward safety. Simulation rounds were impacting all around her, marking her clothing with paint, but she kept moving, kept pulling her wounded teammate to cover. The instructors called a halt to the exercise. They approached Sarah directly, examining her paint-marked uniform. She had been hit multiple times during her rescue attempt. In a real scenario, she would be dead or badly wounded. The lead instructor asked her why she had exposed herself so recklessly. Sarah answered simply that she would not leave a teammate behind. The instructor stared at her for a long moment, then made a note and moved on. The training continued without pause. They were given impossible tasks with inadequate resources and insufficient time. They were forced to make decisions with incomplete information. They operated while starving, while exhausted beyond reason, while every muscle in their bodies screamed for rest. During one exercise, Sarah had gone nearly 70 hours without sleep. She was hallucinating, seeing things that were not there, struggling to maintain basic cognitive function. The instructors gave her a complex problem to solve, a tactical scenario with multiple variables. She forced her failing mind to focus, to think through the problem logically. Her solution was not elegant, but it was sound. She passed. The interrogation phase returned, but more intense than before. They were subjected to stress positions, temperature extremes, sensory deprivation, and aggressive questioning for extended periods. Sarah was isolated in a cold, dark cell for 2 days. The only human contact she had was when instructors would enter to question her, to pressure her, to try to break her will. They used different tactics this time. Instead of just attacking her abilities, they tried to manipulate her emotionally. They told her that her family was disappointed in her. They said she was wasting her life. They offered her an easy way out, a chance to stop suffering, to go back to a normal life. All she had to do was quit. Sarah retreated deep into her mental fortress. She had prepared for this. She knew the tactics, understood the psychology. She held on to her core reasons for being here, the purpose that had driven her through all the previous challenges. When they finally pulled her from the cell, she was weak, disoriented but unbroken. The candidates were slowly being winnowed down. One quit after the long march. 2 more failed the interrogation phase. Another was removed for medical reasons after an injury. The group that remained was small and getting smaller. Everyone left was extraordinary in some way, but not everyone would make it to the end. Sarah noticed that the dynamic among the remaining candidates had changed. The earlier hostility was mostly gone, replaced by a kind of mutual respect born from shared suffering. They had all proven themselves in ways that transcended gender or background. They were simply warriors now, each one pushing through hell beside the others. Even Briggs seemed to have softened somewhat. During one particularly difficult scenario, He and Sarah ended up covering each other in a close-quarters battle simulation. They moved together with the kind of synchronization that came from training and necessity. After the exercise, he approached her briefly. His words were simple. He said she was a solid operator. Coming from him, it was a stunning reversal. The final week brought the most challenging tests yet. They were inserted into a hostile environment simulation with almost no support. They had to navigate enemy territory, gather intelligence, and extract while being actively hunted by skilled trackers. The scenario lasted 5 days with minimal food, no sleep, and constant pressure. Sarah operated on pure will by this point. Her body was breaking down. She had lost significant weight. Her muscles were consuming themselves for energy, but her mind remained sharp, focused on survival and mission completion. She moved through the wilderness like a ghost, avoiding detection, reaching her objectives. On the final day of the scenario, she was captured despite her best efforts. The enemy force was simply too good, too numerous. She was taken to a simulated detention facility, where the final interrogation test would occur. This time, the interrogators were relentless. They had access to her full file, knew her background, her motivations, her vulnerabilities. They attacked her psychologically with surgical precision. They questioned her worth. They showed her fabricated evidence that her fellow candidates thought she did not belong. They told her the unit would never truly accept her, that she would always be an outsider, a token, a symbol, rather than a real operator. Sarah felt something crack inside her, not her resolve, but something deeper. A recognition that some of what they were saying might be true, that even if she passed every test, overcame every obstacle, there would still be those who would never see her as an equal, that the battle for acceptance might never truly end. For a moment, she considered quitting, not because she could not continue, but because the weight of constantly fighting, constantly proving, constantly being scrutinized was suddenly overwhelming. She was so tired. Tired of fighting, tired of being the first, tired of carrying the weight of representation. The final mission brief was delivered in a secure room with maps, satellite imagery, and intelligence documents spread across multiple tables. Commander Hayes walked them through the scenario with clinical precision. A high-value target was located in a compound in hostile territory. The team would insert covertly, gather additional intelligence, capture or eliminate the target, and extract before enemy reinforcements arrived. Every aspect would be evaluated. Every decision would be scrutinized. The scenario was designed to have no perfect solution. Variables would change. Unexpected complications would arise. The team would need to adapt to make difficult choices to perform under maximum stress. This was as close to a real-world operation as training could get without actual combat. The team spent 2 days planning. They studied the target compound until they could walk through it blindfolded. They developed primary and contingency plans. They assigned roles based on individual strengths. Sarah was designated as one of the assault element leaders, responsible for clearing the main building where the target was believed to be located. Morrison was selected as the overall team leader. His combat experience and tactical mind made him the logical choice, and no one objected. He organized the planning sessions efficiently, drawing on each person's expertise, creating a cohesive strategy. Sarah contributed her insights on the breach plan and close-quarters battle tactics. The team dynamics were professional, focused. They functioned as a unit now, not as individuals competing against each other. The night before the exercise, Sarah conducted her personal preparation ritual. She checked every piece of equipment multiple times. She reviewed the plan in her mind, visualizing each phase of the operation. She performed her mental exercises, preparing herself for the stress and chaos that would come. She had learned over months of training that success was built on preparation, and she left nothing to chance. The insertion was conducted via helicopter in darkness. The aircraft flew low and fast over rough terrain, the sound of rotors filling the night. Sarah sat with the others in the cramped space, her weapon across her lap, her mind focused and calm. When the helicopter flared for landing, they moved quickly, flowing out of the aircraft and into the darkness. The team moved toward the target compound with practiced silence. They covered several miles on foot, navigating by night vision and careful map work. Morrison led from the front with Sarah and Jackson forming the main assault element behind him. Chen and the others formed the support element, ready to provide covering fire and security. As they approached the compound, they halted to conduct a final reconnaissance. The target building was exactly where intelligence had indicated, but there were complications. Additional guards were visible, more than expected. The compound layout had some differences from the satellite imagery. Morrison gathered the team for a quick huddle, adjusting the plan to account for the new information. Sarah's role required her to breach the main entrance and clear the ground floor, while Morrison's element secured the perimeter, and Chen's group covered their extraction route. The modifications to the plan changed some timing, but not the fundamental approach. Morrison confirmed everyone understood their adjusted roles, then gave the signal to move. The assault began with synchronized precision. Sarah's element moved to their breach point while the support teams got into position. On Morrison's signal, Sarah initiated the breach. The door came open with controlled force. She flowed through the threshold, weapon up, scanning for threats. The first room was empty. She signaled clear and moved deeper into the building. Behind her, Jackson followed, covering her blind spots. They moved through the ground floor room by room, their teamwork seamless. Every corner checked, every door cleared, moving with the rhythm they had practiced hundreds of times. On the second floor, they encountered the first hostile role players. Sarah engaged immediately, her simulation round striking the targets precisely. Jackson covered the adjacent door as another threat appeared. They neutralized both targets and continued clearing. The target was located in a third-floor room, exactly as intelligence had suggested. Sarah and Jackson secured the room and called for Morrison to bring up the support element. The capture was executed smoothly. The role player acting as the high-value target was secured and prepared for extraction. But then the scenario threw its curveball. The radio crackled with a report from the security element. A large enemy force was approaching faster than anticipated. The team had perhaps 5 minutes before they would be decisively engaged. Morrison had to make a choice. Extract now with minimal intelligence gathered, or stay longer to secure valuable documents and materials from the compound, risking contact with a superior force. Morrison made the call. They would take 2 additional minutes to gather intelligence, then extract rapidly. It was a calculated risk. Sarah and Jackson were designated to secure the documents while Morrison organized the withdrawal. They moved quickly through the target's office, grabbing computers, papers, anything that looked relevant. The 2 minutes felt like hours. Sarah could hear the sound of approaching vehicles in the distance. Her heart was racing, but her hands remained steady as she collected materials. Jackson was doing the same, both of them working with urgent efficiency. Morrison's voice came over the radio. Time was up. They needed to move now. Sarah and Jackson grabbed their loads of intelligence materials and headed for the extraction point. Outside, they could hear the first sounds of contact as the enemy force began to engage the security element. The team moved rapidly toward their extraction point, but the enemy force was trying to cut them off. Morrison adjusted their route, taking them through more difficult terrain but away from the main threat. They were running now, carrying their captive and the intelligence materials, racing against time. The extraction helicopter was scheduled to arrive at a specific time, regardless of whether the team was in position. If they missed that window, they would have to evade on foot for miles through hostile territory. Sarah pushed her exhausted body to move faster. The weight of her equipment and the intelligence materials seemed to double with each step, but she did not slow down. They reached the extraction point with less than a minute to spare. The helicopter was already inbound, its rotor noise growing louder. The team set up a hasty security perimeter, everyone facing outward, ready to defend the landing zone. Sarah could see lights in the distance, the enemy force still pursuing. The helicopter touched down and the team loaded rapidly. The captive was secured. The intelligence materials were stowed. Everyone accounted for. The aircraft lifted off just as the first enemy vehicles came into view. Simulation rounds fired at them, but they were already out of effective range. The mission was complete. Back at the compound, the after-action review lasted for hours. Every decision was examined. Every action was analyzed. The instructors went through the operation moment by moment, identifying what worked and what could have been improved. Morrison's decision to stay for the additional intelligence gathering was questioned extensively. He defended his choice, explaining his reasoning. The instructors neither approved nor disapproved explicitly, but noted that in the real world, such decisions carried life-and-death consequences. Sarah's breach and clearance procedures were reviewed in detail. Carter, The instructor who had pushed her so hard during training conducted this portion of the review. He went through her movements frame by frame using video recorded during the exercise. He pointed out 2 instances where her positioning could have been slightly better. One moment where her muzzle discipline lapsed fractionally. But at the end, he stated that her overall performance was exemplary. He used words like aggressive, controlled, and effective. The entire team's performance was evaluated as successful. They had completed the mission objectives, adapted to changing circumstances, and extracted without any simulated casualties. It was as good an outcome as could be expected given the complexity of the scenario. After the review, Commander Hayes dismissed everyone except the 7 candidates. Once the room was clear of other instructors, he looked at each person individually, his gaze lingering on each face. Then he spoke. He told them that they had completed the most rigorous selection process in the military. They had proven themselves capable of operating at the highest levels. They had demonstrated the physical abilities, mental toughness, tactical proficiency, and character required. Not everyone who started this journey had made it to this point. The 7 of them had earned something that very few people ever achieved. But then his tone shifted. He explained that earning a place in the unit was just the beginning. The real work, the real challenges were still ahead. They would be deployed to the worst places in the world, asked to do the hardest missions, expected to succeed where others could not. The training they had completed was merely preparation for a lifetime of service. That would demand everything they had. He told them that formal notification of their selection would come through official channels within 48 hours. Until then, they were to remain at the facility. He congratulated them, shook each person's hand, and then left the room. 3 years had passed since Sarah had completed selection. 3 years of operations that she could never discuss and places whose names she could never reveal. Against enemies the public would never know existed. She had deployed to 4 continents, conducted missions ranging from intelligence gathering to direct action, earned decorations that would never be publicly acknowledged. The woman who had been mocked for asking for a rifle had become one of the most effective operators in her unit. The morning started like countless others before it. Sarah was on a forward operating base in a country she could not name, preparing for a mission briefing. Her team was tasked with supporting a larger operation, providing reconnaissance and security for a high-value target capture. It was the kind of work they did regularly, dangerous but routine in the strange way that such things became routine for people in this line of work. The briefing room was full of operators from various units, all coordinating for this major operation. Sarah sat with Morrison and Chen, who had remained her closest colleagues over the years. Jackson was deployed elsewhere. Briggs had left the unit after 2 years for personal reasons. The team had changed and evolved, but its core mission remained the same. The briefing was being conducted by a SEAL commander Sarah had not met before. Commander Jameson was a legend in the special operations community, known for leading some of the most successful operations of the past decade. He was a tall man with iron gray hair and the bearing of someone who had spent his entire adult life in harm's way. He commanded immediate respect from everyone in the room. Jameson walked through the operational plan with crisp efficiency. The target was a terrorist leader who had been tracked to a compound in a nearby city. Multiple teams would participate in the operation. Sarah's team would establish an overwatch position to provide intelligence and fire support during the assault. It was a critical role, requiring precision and discipline. As Jameson detailed the timeline and coordination procedures, another officer entered the room and handed him a note. Jameson read it quickly, his expression darkening. He looked up at the assembled operators and told them there had been a development. Intelligence suggested the target might be moving locations sooner than anticipated. They needed additional reconnaissance immediately to confirm his current position. Jameson asked if any team could deploy within the hour to conduct close reconnaissance of the suspected new location. It was a dangerous task requiring someone to move through hostile territory to get eyes on a heavily guarded compound. The room was silent. Most teams needed more time to prepare for such a mission. Sarah stood up. She said her team could be ready in 30 minutes. Jameson looked at her, really looked at her for the first time. His eyes narrowed slightly, taking in her uniform, her rank, her gender. Around the room there were mixed reactions. Some operators nodded approval. Others looked skeptical. A few seemed annoyed that a woman had volunteered for this mission before any of them. Jameson asked if she understood the risks. The reconnaissance would put her team in extremely close proximity to enemy forces. If compromised, support would be limited. Extraction could be problematic. Sarah answered calmly that she understood completely, and her team was capable of executing the mission. The SEAL commander studied her for a moment longer, clearly weighing his decision. In that brief pause, Sarah could see him calculating, assessing, probably wondering if he should trust a woman for such a critical task. She had seen that look before, though less frequently as her reputation had grown. She waited patiently for his decision. One of the SEAL officers in the room, a man with lieutenant commander rank insignia, leaned toward Jameson and whispered something. Sarah could not hear the words, but she could guess their content. The tone suggested skepticism, perhaps even a recommendation against using her team. Jameson's expression did not change, but he glanced at the officer and then back at Sarah. Finally, Jameson asked for her team designation. Sarah provided it. He wrote it down, then asked for her operational call sign. Sarah hesitated for just a fraction of a second. Her code name was not something she used casually. It was reserved for operational communications, for situations where her actual identity needed to be protected. But this was an operational briefing, so she provided it. The moment Sarah spoke her code name, something changed in the room. Jameson's pen stopped moving. His eyes snapped up to her face, really seeing her now, not just assessing but recognizing. The skeptical SEAL officer who had been whispering suddenly went quiet. Around the room, several other operators who apparently recognized the code name were exchanging glances. Jameson put down his pen slowly. He asked Sarah to confirm her code name, as if he needed to hear it again to believe it. She repeated it clearly. The SEAL commander stood up straighter, his entire demeanor shifting. He asked if she was the same operator who had conducted the reconnaissance mission in Kandahar 2 years ago, the one that had prevented a major attack on coalition forces. Sarah confirmed that was her operation. Jameson continued, asking about another mission, this one involving the rescue of hostages from a compound in another undisclosed location. Sarah acknowledged that mission as well. With each confirmation, the atmosphere in the room transformed. The skepticism was evaporating, replaced by recognition and respect. Jameson walked around the table until he was standing directly in front of Sarah. He said that he had read the reports from those operations. He had used them as case studies in advanced training courses. The tactical decisions, the precision of execution, the results achieved had been exemplary. He said that the reports had never included a photo, never mentioned anything that had identified the operator's gender. He had simply assumed, like most people would, that such exceptional performance had come from a man. The SEAL commander extended his hand to Sarah. He said he would be honored to have her team conduct the reconnaissance. He apologized for his initial hesitation, acknowledging his own unconscious bias. He told her that if even half of what was in those reports was accurate, she was exactly the operator they needed for this mission. Sarah shook his hand, maintaining her professional composure, though internally she felt a surge of satisfaction. This was the validation she had worked for, earned through actions and results rather than words. Jameson returned to the front of the room and began briefing Sarah's team specifically on the reconnaissance mission, while the others listened. The mission launched an hour later. Sarah's team moved through the city with the stealth and precision that had become their trademark. They reached an overwatch position that provided clear observation of the suspected compound. Sarah personally conducted the surveillance, identifying targets, tracking movement patterns, gathering the intelligence needed for the assault. Her reports back to the Tactical Operations Center were clear and detailed. She confirmed the high-value target was indeed at this new location. She provided exact counts of guards, weapon systems, and security measures. She identified the optimal approach routes for the assault force. Her information was so thorough that Jameson was able to refine his entire operational plan based on her reconnaissance. The assault itself went exactly as planned, largely because of the intelligence Sarah had provided. The target was captured alive. No friendly casualties were sustained. The operation was being hailed as a significant success. During the post-operation debrief, Jameson specifically credited Sarah's reconnaissance work as critical to the mission's success. Afterward, as the teams were preparing to return to their main base, Jameson approached Sarah privately. He told her that he had spent his entire career in special operations, had worked with some of the best operators in the world. He said that what impressed him most was not just her technical skills or tactical abilities, but her composure and professionalism in the face of skepticism and bias. He acknowledged that she had faced barriers that her male counterparts never encountered, yet she had overcome them through excellence. Jameson said something else too, something that struck Sarah deeply. He told her that his daughter was currently in military training, aspiring to follow in his footsteps into special operations. He had worried about the challenges she would face, the resistance she would encounter. But seeing Sarah's success, knowing that women were not just participating but excelling at the highest levels, gave him hope. He thanked her, not just for her service, but for opening doors that would make the path easier for those who came after. Sarah appreciated his words, but she was also realistic. She knew that her success, while significant, had not eliminated all barriers. There were still people who doubted, still systems that made things unnecessarily difficult, still cultures that needed to evolve. But progress was being made. Other women were entering the pipeline, completing selection, earning their places. Each success made the next one slightly easier. That evening, back at the forward operating base, Sarah sat alone in the communications room, updating her mission logs. She thought about the journey that had brought her to this point. From the first day when she had been mocked for simply asking for a rifle, through the brutal selection,